If you thought you could get away with never throwing away your kitchenware but always throwing away your scraps, then think again. To make sure your meals are always safe and delicious, avoid these common kitchen mistakes. It's easy to skip preheating, especially when you're in a rush, but if you do, you'll miss out on better flavor and texture. If you add food to a cold pan, it'll cook unevenly, as different parts of the pan heat faster. Preheating also aids in caramelization. A hot pan quickly evaporates any moisture from the surface of meat or vegetables and creates a crispy, flavorful browned exterior. Furthermore, starting with a cold pan will result in the ingredients sticking to the surface as they cook, and you'll then have to scrape the pan clean after cooking. For best results, turn the stove top on and let the pan heat for about a minute. You can hold your hand a safe distance above the pan to feel when it's warm. Let the pan heat on its own before adding any cooking oil, and then let the oil heat evenly before adding your ingredients. Baked goods rely on specific reactions between ingredients to achieve the desired result, which can only happen if the ingredients are measured correctly. Simply put, when it comes to baking, precision matters. The wrong ratio of flour to wet ingredients or an insufficient amount of a leavening agent can ruin the recipe before it even goes in the oven. The best way to avoid these mistakes is to simply follow the recipe carefully and thoroughly. It's also important to use the proper techniques to measure different baking ingredients. When measuring dry ingredients like flour, baking powder, and sugar, it's important not to pack the ingredients down, as this will lead to adding too much. Instead, use a measuring cup to scoop the dry ingredients from the container and let them pile over top of the measuring cup. Then use a flat tool like a butter knife to scrape the excess off the top and make it perfectly level with the measuring cup. For liquid, it's better to utilize a spouted liquid measuring cup, and be sure to get it eye level with the cup to ensure that you've poured the right amount. After cooking steak or chicken, recipes often specify for the meat to rest for several minutes before slicing it. It's easy to overlook this crucial step, but it's essential to achieving a perfectly juicy and tender cut. It may test your patience, but you'll be able to taste the difference. After the meat rests and cools, the fibers will relax, and the flavorful juices have time to redistribute and be absorbed into the cut of meat. If you cut it before it's had time to reabsorb those juices, the excess liquid will spill out, and all that delicious flavor will be lost. Generally, letting meat dishes rest for 5 to 10 minutes will produce the desired results, although larger pieces will need additional resting time. Using a dull knife not only makes cutting harder, but it's also dangerous, as it requires more pressure to cut through produce and other foods. And because you have to push down harder to create that pressure, the blade is more likely to slip and result in injuries.
Be careful, because I nicked myself the other day.
I don't know, I'm kind of scared.
There you go.
Conversely, a well-sharpened knife is able to glide through food easily. This also results in cleaner cuts that don't have misshapen or jagged edges. How often you should sharpen your kitchen knives depends on how often you use them. If you're a frequent cook, then sharpening them once a week should keep them in good condition. But if you're only cooking a few nights per week, you may only need to sharpen them every other week. There are a few effective ways to safely check if a knife is dull. The paper test involves holding a sheet of paper by the edge and cutting downward and diagonally at a 45-degree angle. If the knife catches on the paper, then it needs to be sharpened. Many foods are kept their freshest in the refrigerator, but others may lose their flavor while in cold storage. This is particularly true in the case of tomatoes, bread, and other everyday groceries. Keeping tomatoes cold can compromise their firm but juicy texture, while bread becomes stale in the fridge and is much better suited to being kept covered in the pantry. Then there are avocados and bananas, which will finish ripening to achieve the perfect flavor and texture when stored on the countertop. Potatoes also maintain their texture best when stored in a dry, cool place. Coffee is another bad choice to store in the fridge, as it can absorb flavors from the food around it. Fresh herbs can also lose their flavor and become less effective when stored in the fridge. When deciding where to store food, just think of where they're stocked in a grocery store. In general, produce that's sold at room temperature can often stay that way at home until it's sliced. Overmixing dough is a common mistake that ruins the texture of baked goods. This is especially frequent with new bakers, though it can happen to anyone. The reason this is a problem is because it leads to too much gluten development. Although gluten is important to the structure of pastries, bread, and other baked goods, too much creates dense, overly chewy results. Creating the right texture is achieved by striking the right balance between under and over mixing. This may sound difficult to pull off, but it's not too hard once you know what to look for, and it'll make a world of difference. The appropriate look and feel of dough varies depending on the specific recipe, so read through the directions in advance to make sure you understand what you're looking for. Then make sure to proceed slowly, mixing until the dough or batter reaches the desired consistency and stopping without mixing any further. Properly preparing vegetables can make all the difference in the final dish. To keep them from becoming mushy and unappetizing, it's essential to dry them before cooking. Perhaps you've already been taught to rinse fresh produce under cold water to get rid of any dirt or pesticides. This is excellent advice, but don't stop there. The next step is to dry the produce thoroughly. This is especially important when roasting or sautéing veggies. If they have excess moisture on the outside, it'll prevent them from browning properly and achieving the desired crispy texture. If you add wet veggies straight into the pan, they'll become soggy from cooking in the liquid. To let vegetables dry, arrange them on a clean towel on the countertop and leave them to air dry for about 20 minutes, or thoroughly hand dry for faster results. You can also salt them to help draw out excess moisture more quickly. Whether you're cooking in the oven, on the stovetop, or in an Instant Pot, it's important to give the ingredients plenty of space to cook. If you're trying to make enough food to feed a large group or to have leftovers, you may end up with more food than fits in one pan. But trying to cram it all into one dish will lead to uneven cooking, incorrect browning, and steaming instead of searing. To avoid this cooking disaster, just utilize 2 pans. If, however, you don't have extra pans available, you can separate cooking into batches. It'll make your time in the kitchen a little longer, but you should be happy with the results. If you're unsure how much food to add to a pan, a good rule of thumb is to add only as much as can fit in a single layer.
Good idea.
You should always resist the urge to open the oven while something is in there baking. You can make an exception once or twice towards the end of the baking time to check if your food is done, but frequently opening the oven door can ruin the recipe. This is especially damaging when baking cakes and other things that need to rise. Opening the oven door releases some of the hot air and allows cold air to come in, which can cause a cake to collapse in the middle. If you can't resist this urge, just use the oven light to check on the baking progress. There are a few cases when opening the oven may be warranted. For example, if a cake appears to be cooking too quickly around the outside, you can open the oven to tent the dish in foil. This will lock in moisture and keep the top from browning too quickly. After making this adjustment, be sure to close the oven door again and keep it closed. The best way to avoid over- or undercooking meat is to check the internal temperature. This is an important step for both safety and flavor. If meat isn't properly cooked, it can lead to foodborne illness, so always keep a meat thermometer in the kitchen. According to the Food and Drug Administration, meats like beef, pork, veal, lamb roasts, steaks, and chops should be cooked until they reach an internal temperature of at least 145 degrees Fahrenheit. For ground meat, it's a little higher as it should be cooked to 160 degrees. Poultry, such as chicken and turkey, should go even higher than that, specifically 165 degrees. When checking the temperature, make sure to insert the thermometer at the thickest portion of the meat and push it to the center to get an accurate reading.
They're done. Boop. And so am I.
Meat, bones, and vegetable scraps may seem like trash, but you can save them to make homemade broth, stocks, and other recipes. This avoids excess waste and is an excellent way to create incredible flavor. You can gather scraps over a period of time until you have enough for a new recipe. Keep veggie skins and scraps stored in the fridge or freezer until you have enough to simmer in water and make some homemade broth. Similarly, any overripe pieces of vegetables that don't taste good when they're fresh are excellent candidates to add to soup or toss into a smoothie. After carving meat, save the bones to make a flavorful and hearty stock, and they can still be utilized afterwards to make a remouillage. Remouillage is a French cooking term for a second stock made with the same meat bones. You can add those used bones to a stock pot along with water and vegetables for extra flavor and simmering until the liquid becomes a rich, savory broth.
You take this home, throw it in a pot, add some broth, a potato. Baby, you got a stew going.
New high-quality kitchen tools can be quite expensive, but holding on to the same old pans you've had for years may be ruining your food. Nonstick pans are a highly convenient tool for cooking, as they reduce the need for excessive cleanup and make it so that you don't need as much cooking oil. But cooking with old and damaged nonstick pans increases the risk of toxic particles making their way into your food. This is because they're often coated with PFAS.
PFAS are what's known as forever chemicals.
Nonstick pans are generally still safe to use, assuming that you follow the manufacturer's instructions. Don't overheat the pan and don't use damaged pans. But overheated and old pans that have visible signs of wear can be dangerous. When buying replacement pans, you can look for ones that don't contain PFAS to avoid this concern entirely. For safe cooking, you should use different cutting boards according to what type of food is being prepared. Using one cutting board for everything can lead to the spread of germs via cross-contamination. It's best to have at least 2 cutting boards in the kitchen. Reserve one for preparing raw meat and one for fresh produce. And remember to wash and dry them in between uses. Brittany Saunier, Executive Director at the Partnership for Food Safety Education, explained to Southern Living why using different cutting boards is so essential by noting, fresh veggies or fruit are often consumed raw and do not have a kill step. Having separate cutting boards will help reduce your risk of food poisoning. In addition to using separate cutting boards, it's also important to prevent any potential contamination by washing your hands and using clean knives.